Imagine you hold in your hands the key to preventing one of the greatest disasters in modern history. You have traveled across an ocean under deep cover, risking your life, carrying a secret so explosive it could save thousands of lives. You walk into the office of the most powerful law enforcement official in the nation, and you tell him exactly what is about to happen, where it will happen, and how it will unfold. And he looks at you with contempt. Not because your information is wrong, not because you lack credibility, but because he saw you with a woman the night before, because you wear expensive suits, because you gamble at high-stakes tables and drink champagne with actresses, because in his rigid, paranoid mind, a man who enjoys life cannot possibly be telling the truth about death. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This happened. In the summer of 1941, a dashing Yugoslav playboy walked into FBI headquarters in New York City carrying microfilm evidence of Japan's plans to attack Pearl Harbor. His name was Duško Popov. His code name was Tricycle, and the world would have called him the greatest spy who ever lived, except that J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, hated him on sight, hated him so deeply, so personally, so irrationally that he buried the warning Popov brought. He never passed it to naval intelligence. He never alerted the War Department. He let his personal disgust for a man's lifestyle override his professional duty to protect his country. And 4 months later, on a quiet Sunday morning in December, over 2,000 Americans died in flames and explosions because one bitter, repressed bureaucrat could not separate the messenger from the message. This is the story of how the real-life inspiration for James Bond tried to save America from catastrophe, and how America's top cop decided that a spy who slept with beautiful women couldn't possibly know what he was talking about. It is a story of intelligence, intuition, and insight, crushed under the weight of prejudice, prudishness, and pride. It is the story of Duško Popov, the man who warned America, and J. Edgar Hoover, the man who refused to listen. Duško Popov was born in 1912 in Titel, a small town in what was then Austria-Hungary and would later become Yugoslavia. From his earliest years, he possessed a kind of effortless charm that opened doors wherever he went. He was tall, athletic, multilingual, and devastatingly handsome. He moved through European high society like a shark through water, equally comfortable in the drawing rooms of London, the casinos of Monte Carlo, and the nightclubs of Berlin. He studied law at the University of Freiburg in Germany during the rise of the Nazi Party, and there he made a friendship that would shape the rest of his life. His closest friend was a young German named Johann Jebsen, a fellow law student who came from a wealthy shipping family. Jebsen was witty, cultured, and deeply opposed to the Nazi regime despite his impeccable Aryan credentials. The two men became inseparable, spending their university years arguing philosophy, chasing women, and cultivating a lifestyle of sophisticated hedonism. But when war came, their paths diverged in the most dangerous way possible. Jebsen, unable to escape Germany, was recruited into the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service. Popov, returning to Yugoslavia, watched his country collapse under the Nazi invasion in April 1941. It was Jebsen who approached Popov with an offer that seemed insane. Work for German intelligence. Spy for the Reich. Use your international connections, your charm, your business contacts to gather information for the Abwehr. And Popov, seeing an opportunity that few men would have the courage to seize, said yes. But he said yes for a reason that would have gotten him executed on the spot if the Germans had known. Before accepting Jebsen's recruitment, Popov contacted the British. He offered to become a double agent, pretending to work for Germany while actually feeding the Nazis false information carefully crafted by British intelligence. It was an offer MI6 could not refuse. The British had been devastated by German intelligence successes in the early years of the war. They desperately needed agents inside the Nazi intelligence apparatus, and here was Popov, golden boy of the Balkans, offering himself up as a Trojan horse. The British gave him a code name that would become legendary in the secret world of espionage, Tricycle. The origin of the code name has been debated for decades. Some claim it referred to his habit of juggling 3 girlfriends at once. Others insist it was a reference to his management of 3 separate intelligence channels. Popov himself enjoyed the ambiguity, understanding that in the spy business, mystique is as valuable as information. Whatever the origin, Tricycle became one of the most successful double agents of World War II, a key part of the British double-cross system that fed the Germans a steady diet of misinformation while protecting genuine Allied secrets. In the summer of 1941, the Abwehr gave Popov an assignment that would take him across the Atlantic. He was to travel to the United States, ostensibly on business for his family's import-export firm, but actually to establish an espionage network on American soil. The United States was not yet in the war, still clinging to neutrality despite British pleas for help, and German intelligence was desperate for information about American military preparations, industrial capacity, and political intentions. Popov was given a generous budget, contact information for German sympathizers in America, and a list of intelligence requirements from his Abwehr handlers. But hidden inside his luggage was something far more significant than routine espionage instructions. Concealed in the shaft of a modified tie clip was a tiny square of microfilm, barely visible to the naked eye, containing a document that would later be recognized as one of the most important intelligence warnings of the entire war. The microfilm contained a detailed questionnaire about Pearl Harbor. Not just casual questions, not vague inquiries about Hawaiian defenses in general, but specific, technical, obsessively detailed questions about the naval base at Pearl Harbor. Where exactly were the anchorages for battleships? What was the depth of the water in each berth? Were there torpedo nets protecting the ships? What types of nets? What was the spacing between vessels? How many planes were stationed at Hickam Field and Wheeler Field? What were their types and readiness status? How many hangars were there, and what was their construction? The questionnaire was methodical, comprehensive, and terrifying in its implications. Even more alarming was the context that Popov immediately recognized. The questions bore an uncanny resemblance to the intelligence gathering that had preceded the British attack on the Italian naval base at Taranto in November 1940. In that operation, British torpedo bombers from the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious had devastated the Italian fleet in a surprise night attack, proving that torpedoes could be modified to run in shallow harbor waters and that a carrier-based airstrike could cripple a fleet at anchor. The attack had revolutionized naval warfare and sent shockwaves through every major navy in the world. The Japanese had studied the Taranto raid obsessively, sending observers and demanding detailed reports. Now, here was Germany, Japan's Axis ally, asking for precisely the same type of information about the American Pacific Fleet's main base. The conclusion was inescapable. Japan was planning a carrier-based air attack on Pearl Harbor. The questionnaire was not academic curiosity. It was targeting data for an impending operation. Popov understood the implications immediately. He was a lawyer by training, a spy by circumstance, but a patriot at heart despite his cynical exterior. He had agreed to work as a double agent, not for money or excitement, though those motivations certainly existed, but because he believed the Nazi regime represented an existential threat to civilization. Now he held evidence of another Axis threat, one that could drag America into the war in the most catastrophic way possible. If the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor without warning, the U.S. Pacific Fleet could be destroyed, American entry into the war might be delayed or undermined by defeatism, and the entire balance of power in the Pacific could shift toward Japan. Popov knew he had to warn the Americans. The question was how to do it in a way that would be taken seriously without compromising his cover as a German agent. When Popov's ship docked in New York in August 1941, he followed protocol and made contact with the FBI. This was standard procedure for foreign intelligence operatives entering the United States, even friendly ones. The British had arranged for Popov to work with the FBI during his time in America, sharing his information about German intelligence activities and coordinating his double agent work under American supervision. Popov met with several FBI agents in New York and explained his mission. He showed them the microfilm. He walked them through the Pearl Harbor questionnaire point by point. He explained the significance of the questions in light of the Taranto attack. He told them that in his professional judgment, based on years of experience in the intelligence world, this document indicated that Japan was preparing to launch a surprise attack on the American fleet in Hawaii. The FBI agents who met with Popov understood the gravity of what he was telling them. They wrote detailed reports. They forwarded the information to FBI headquarters in Washington. And then something extraordinary happened. The information hit the desk of J. Edgar Hoover. And there it died. Not because Hoover failed to understand it. Not because he lacked context, but because Hoover had taken an immediate and visceral dislike to Dusko Popov. And in the paranoid, power-obsessed world that Hoover inhabited, personal feelings trumped national security. To understand why Hoover reacted the way he did, you need to understand who J. Edgar Hoover was in 1941. He was already the most powerful, unelected official in America, a position he had built through a combination of bureaucratic genius, publicity manipulation, and ruthless destruction of anyone who threatened his authority. He had become director of the Bureau of Investigation, later renamed the FBI in 1924 at the age of just 29, and he would hold that position until his death in 1972, spanning 8 presidents and serving for an astonishing 48 years. Hoover had built the FBI into a formidable law enforcement agency, pioneering scientific crime-fighting techniques and creating a national fingerprint database. But he had also built it as a personal fiefdom, loyal to him first and America second. Hoover was a man of rigid habits, obsessive control, and deep-seated personal insecurities. He lived with his mother until her death. He never married. He had a decades-long relationship with his deputy director, Clyde Tolson. That was the subject of constant speculation, but never publicly acknowledged. Hoover compensated for whatever inner turmoil he felt by projecting an image of uncompromising morality and patriotic rectitude. He saw himself as America's guardian against moral decay as much as against crime. And in his rigidly black-and-white worldview, people fell into clear categories: patriots and subversives, moral citizens and degenerates, people who followed the rules and people who flouted them. Dusko Popov, from the moment Hoover learned about him, fell squarely into the degenerate category. Hoover received reports about Popov's activities in New York and was immediately disgusted. Popov was staying at the finest hotels, eating at expensive restaurants, and, most offensively, entertaining a series of beautiful women. He was gambling at high stakes. He was drinking champagne. He was, in Hoover's eyes, behaving like exactly the kind of loose-living European playboy that represented everything morally wrong with the world. The fact that Popov's lifestyle was part of his cover, essential to maintaining his credibility with the Germans who expected their agents to live well and move in wealthy circles, meant nothing to Hoover. The fact that Popov was risking his life working for the Allies meant nothing. All Hoover could see was the behavior, and the behavior offended him to his core. What pushed Hoover over the edge was a specific incident that would become infamous in intelligence circles. Shortly after arriving in New York, Popov traveled to Miami on what appeared to be a pleasure trip, but was actually a meeting with a German contact. While in Miami, he stayed at a luxury hotel and was seen in the company of a particularly striking French actress. The FBI was conducting surveillance on Popov, as was standard procedure, and agents reported his activities in detail to Washington. One report mentioned that Popov had spent the night with the actress in his hotel room. When this report reached Hoover's desk, something snapped. Hoover fired off a series of furious memos demanding that Popov be arrested immediately for violating the Mann Act, a federal law prohibiting the transportation of women across state lines for immoral purposes. The Mann Act had been passed in 1910 to combat sex trafficking, but had been weaponized by Hoover over the years as a tool to destroy people he considered immoral. Never mind that Popov had not actually transported anyone across state lines. Never mind that the actress in question was an adult who had traveled to Miami of her own accord. Never mind that the entire premise was absurd. Hoover wanted Popov arrested, and his subordinates had to work frantically to convince him that arresting a British intelligence asset in the middle of a sensitive operation would be catastrophic for relations with America's closest ally. Hoover backed down on the arrest, but he did not back down on his hatred. From that point forward, Dusko Popov was, in Hoover's mind, a degenerate, a liar, and a man whose word could not be trusted. And when FBI agents came to Hoover and said that this degenerate was warning about an imminent attack on Pearl Harbor, Hoover's response was dismissive contempt. He told his subordinates that Popov was probably trying to create panic, or inflate his own importance, or trick the Americans into revealing their defensive preparations. He said the information was not credible. He said it did not warrant further investigation. And most damningly, he refused to pass the warning to naval intelligence or Army intelligence or anyone in the military chain of command who might have acted on it. The Pearl Harbor questionnaire sat in FBI files, unshared, unanalyzed, and ultimately useless. Now, here is where the story becomes almost unbearably tragic, because Popov's warning was not the only indication the United States had that Japan was planning something against Hawaii. The historical record is now clear that there were multiple warnings, multiple intelligence indicators, multiple red flags waving frantically in the months before December 7, 1941. American cryptographers had broken Japanese diplomatic codes and were reading Japan's secret communications, an operation known as magic. These decrypts showed increasing Japanese interest in Hawaii. American naval intelligence had noted unusual patterns in Japanese naval communications and ship movements. The American ambassador to Japan, Joseph Grew, had sent a warning in January 1941, 10 months before the attack, reporting rumors that Japan planned to attack Pearl Harbor if relations deteriorated. But each warning, each indicator, each piece of the puzzle was held by a different agency, a different department, a different bureaucratic fiefdom. The Army and Navy did not share information effectively. Intelligence agencies guarded their sources jealously, and no one had the authority or the vision to put all the pieces together into a coherent picture. This fragmentation meant that Popov's warning, which should have been a clarion call, instead became just another data point lost in the noise. If Hoover had passed Popov's information to the Office of Naval Intelligence, it might have been the catalyst that forced different agencies to compare notes. The specific, detailed nature of the Pearl Harbor questionnaire could have cut through the ambiguity of other intelligence and made the threat crystal clear. But Hoover's refusal to share the information ensured that this piece of the puzzle remained locked in an FBI filing cabinet. And there is evidence that suggests Hoover's obstruction was not passive but active. When British intelligence officials, concerned that their warning through Popov had not been heeded, made discreet inquiries with American counterparts about whether the Pearl Harbor information had been acted upon, they were told that, yes, appropriate authorities had been notified. This was a lie. Hoover, or officials acting on his authority, had essentially covered up the fact that the warning had been buried. They did not want the British to know that the FBI had dropped the ball, or, more accurately, had deliberately refused to pick it up. So the British believed the warning had been passed along and that American military commanders had assessed the threat and decided to handle it through their own channels. In reality, the admirals and generals in Hawaii had no idea that a German spy had delivered targeting data for a Japanese attack plan. Have you ever been judged not by what you know, but by who you are? Have you ever walked into a room with a brilliant idea, a critical insight, a truth that needed to be heard, only to watch people dismiss you because they did not like your clothes, your accent, your lifestyle, your face? Have you ever watched an opportunity die, a project fail, a disaster unfold because someone in power decided that you were not the right kind of person to listen to? Dusko Popov lived that nightmare on a scale few of us can imagine. He held information that could have prevented one of the worst military disasters in American history, and he was ignored because a powerful man found him personally distasteful. Think about that for a moment. Not because his information was wrong, not because he lacked credibility in the intelligence community, not because the warning was ambiguous, but because he enjoyed the company of women and liked to gamble, because he wore expensive suits and drank expensive wine, because he lived his cover with such conviction that it offended a man who had spent his life building a facade of moral purity. If you have ever felt the frustration of being dismissed for superficial reasons, drop a comment below. Tell me about a time when bias, prejudice, or personal dislike killed an idea that deserved to live. Tell me about a time when someone's character was judged by irrelevant standards while their competence was ignored. Because what happened to Popov was not just a historical tragedy. It is a pattern that repeats itself in offices, boardrooms, and government chambers every single day. The right messenger gets ignored. The uncomfortable truth gets buried. And people suffer because those in power care more about their prejudices than their responsibilities. Through September, October, and November of 1941, Popov continued his work in America, feeding carefully controlled misinformation to his German handlers while the FBI maintained surveillance and British intelligence coordinated his activities from London. But the easy cooperation that should have existed never materialized. Hoover's hostility poisoned the well. FBI agents assigned to work with Popov found themselves caught between their professional duty and their director's personal vendetta. Some agents genuinely liked Popov and respected his work. They could see that he was a competent, courageous operative who was providing valuable intelligence about German operations. But they also knew that showing too much enthusiasm for working with Popov could end their careers. Hoover demanded absolute loyalty, and any agent who went over his head or contradicted his judgments could find themselves transferred to some remote field office or worse. So the agents did their jobs, but without the creativity, initiative, or urgency that might have made a difference. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy was preparing for the most audacious military operation in its history. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had been planning the attack on Pearl Harbor for months. Yamamoto understood that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. America's industrial capacity was simply too vast. Japan's only hope, in Yamamoto's strategic calculus, was to deliver a devastating knockout blow at the very beginning, destroying the U.S. Pacific Fleet before it could be brought to bear, and then hoping that American will to fight would collapse in the face of such a catastrophic defeat. It was a desperate gamble, and Yamamoto knew it. He reportedly told colleagues that he could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that he had no confidence in Japan's prospects. Still, civilian leaders in Tokyo had decided on war, and it was Yamamoto's duty to give Japan the best possible chance. The attack plan was brilliant in its conception and terrifying in its scale. A carrier strike force of 6 fleet carriers, the largest concentration of naval air power ever assembled, would cross the Pacific in absolute radio silence, approach Hawaii from the north, and launch 2 waves of aircraft against Pearl Harbor and nearby airfields. Torpedo bombers would strike the battleships in the harbor. Dive bombers would destroy hangars, fuel tanks, and repair facilities. Fighters would strafe parked aircraft and establish air superiority. If everything went according to plan, the U.S. Pacific Fleet would be crippled, and America's ability to project power into the Western Pacific would be paralyzed for at least a year, possibly longer. The Japanese were meticulous in their preparations. They studied the Taranto raid exhaustively, learning lessons about shallow water torpedo attacks and nighttime navigation. They modified their aerial torpedoes with wooden fins that would allow them to run in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. They trained relentlessly, practicing on a harbor in Japan that resembled Pearl Harbor's layout. They gathered intelligence through their consulate in Honolulu, where a young intelligence officer named Takeo Yoshikawa conducted surveillance of the fleet, noting ship movements and defensive preparations, and they benefited from perhaps their greatest advantage, American complacency. The prevailing view in Washington and Hawaii was that Japan would not dare attack American territory directly. If war came, it would start with a Japanese move against British or Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia, dragging America in as an ally defending its colonial friends. The idea that Japan would open hostilities with a surprise attack on the American fleet struck most American officials as strategically insane. They were right that it was strategically insane. Yamamoto himself believed the attack guaranteed Japan's eventual defeat by ensuring America would fight to the bitter end, rather than negotiating a compromise peace. But being strategically insane did not make the attack less likely. It made it more likely, because the Americans could not imagine that Japan would do something so self-destructive. This failure of imagination, this inability to believe that an adversary might act irrationally by your standards, even while acting rationally by their own, is one of the classic traps in intelligence analysis. The Americans assumed Japan would behave according to American logic. The Japanese assumed America would behave according to Japanese concepts of honor and face. Both were wrong, and the misunderstanding paved the road to catastrophe. In November 1941, the Japanese carrier strike force assembled in the Kuril Islands, in the cold waters north of Japan. On November 26th, they set sail, steaming eastward across the North Pacific in radio silence. American intelligence lost track of the carriers. Naval intelligence officers in Washington noted the disappearance of the Japanese carriers from their tracking charts and issued queries to Pacific commands asking if anyone had sightings. No one did. The carriers had vanished. Some intelligence analysts in Washington began to worry. Where were the carriers? What were they doing? But the prevailing assumption was that the carriers were either in home waters preparing for operations in Southeast Asia or perhaps moving south toward the Philippines. The idea that they might be steaming toward Hawaii in a mass formation was considered so unlikely that it barely registered as a possibility. On December 2, 1941, the Japanese government sent a coded message to its embassy in Washington ordering the destruction of code machines and classified documents. This was the diplomatic equivalent of loading a gun. American cryptographers intercepted and decoded the message. In Washington, senior officials understood that war was imminent. But where would the Japanese strike? The consensus answer was Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies. Those were the targets that made sense, that fit Japanese strategic needs for oil and resources, that matched the pattern of Japanese expansion. On December 6th, American cryptographers decoded the first 13 parts of a 14-part Japanese message that was clearly a declaration that negotiations had failed. The 14th part, decoded early on the morning of December 7th, instructed Japanese diplomats to deliver the message to the U.S. government at exactly 1 p.m. Washington time. An Army intelligence officer, looking at that specific timing, did a quick calculation and realized that 1 p.m. in Washington was early morning in Hawaii, dawn in the Philippines, late afternoon in Malaya. The timing suggested an attack was coming, and it was coming soon. Warnings were sent out to military commanders in the Pacific, but they were vague, and they traveled slowly through military communications channels. The warning message to Hawaii was sent by commercial telegraph because atmospheric conditions were interfering with military radio. It arrived in Honolulu on the morning of December 7th and sat in a telegraph office waiting to be delivered to Fort Shafter. It would not reach Army headquarters until hours after the attack had begun. At Pearl Harbor, Sunday morning, December 7th, was routine and lazy. Most of the fleet was in port. Sailors were sleeping in, eating breakfast, writing letters home. Officers were planning to play golf or spend the day with their families. It was a beautiful Hawaiian morning, warm and clear, the kind of day that makes you grateful to be alive. And then, at 7:55 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over the island of Oahu. There were 183 planes in the first wave: torpedo bombers, dive bombers, horizontal bombers, and fighters. They came in low and fast, and they caught the Americans completely by surprise. Within minutes, torpedoes were slamming into the hulls of battleships. Bombs were exploding on decks and hangars, and the harbor was transforming into an inferno of burning oil and exploding ammunition. The battleship USS Arizona was hit by an armor-piercing bomb that penetrated her forward magazine. The resulting explosion was so massive it lifted the ship's bow out of the water and broke her back. She sank in 9 minutes, taking 177 men with her, more than half of the total American dead that day. The Oklahoma took multiple torpedo hits and capsized, trapping over 400 men inside her overturned hull. The West Virginia, the California, and the Nevada were all heavily damaged. The Nevada tried to make a run for the harbor entrance but had to be deliberately beached to prevent her from sinking in the channel and blocking the harbor entirely. At the airfields, the destruction was equally complete. American planes had been parked wingtip to wingtip, bunched together to make them easier to guard against sabotage, and this made them perfect targets for strafing attacks. Entire squadrons were destroyed on the ground without ever getting into the air. Of the nearly 400 American aircraft in Hawaii, more than half were destroyed or damaged. Only a handful of American pilots managed to get airborne and engage the attackers. The second wave of Japanese aircraft, 171 planes, arrived at 8:40 a.m. and continued the devastation. By the time the attack ended, just before 10:00 a.m., 8 battleships had been sunk or damaged. 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers had been hit, and nearly 200 aircraft had been destroyed. American casualties were staggering: 2,403 dead, 1,178 wounded. It was the worst military disaster in American history, and it could have been prevented, or at least the damage could have been minimized. If Popov's warning had been heeded, the fleet might have been at sea on December 7th, dispersed and alert rather than concentrated in harbor and caught sleeping. If the intelligence community had connected the dots, if different agencies had shared information effectively, if anyone had taken seriously the possibility of a carrier-based surprise attack, the story might have been very different. But none of that happened. The warnings were ignored. The intelligence was compartmentalized. The signs were misread, and men died because of it. When news of the Pearl Harbor attack reached Washington, there was shock, grief, and fury. President Roosevelt delivered his famous Day of Infamy speech, and Congress declared war on Japan, with only one dissenting vote. The American people, divided and uncertain about entering the war just hours before, united overnight in determination to fight. The Japanese had succeeded in their immediate military objective of crippling the Pacific Fleet, but they had failed catastrophically in their strategic objective of breaking American will. Instead, they had awakened, as Yamamoto himself had feared, a sleeping giant. In the chaos and recrimination that followed the attack, there was an immediate search for scapegoats. How had this happened? How had the Japanese achieved complete surprise? Who had failed in their duty? The commander of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Husband Kimmel, and the commander of the Army's Hawaiian Department, General Walter Short, were relieved of command and effectively blamed for the disaster. Multiple investigations were launched, each digging through the intelligence failures, the lack of coordination, the missed warnings. And buried in the FBI files was Duško Popov's report about the Pearl Harbor questionnaire, still unshared, still unexamined by military intelligence, still ignored. When British intelligence officials learned that the attack had occurred, they were stunned. They made inquiries with American counterparts and discovered to their horror that the warning Popov had delivered had never been passed to the military. The British were furious. They had sent one of their best agents to warn the Americans, and the warning had been buried by bureaucratic incompetence, or worse, by personal animosity. There were tense conversations between British and American intelligence services. The British wanted to know why the warning had been ignored. The Americans, or at least some of them, wanted to know the same thing. But J. Edgar Hoover was J. Edgar Hoover. He was untouchable. He had files on everyone who mattered in Washington, detailed dossiers full of personal secrets, embarrassing information, and leverage. Congressmen, senators, presidents, all of them knew that crossing Hoover was dangerous. So, when questions were raised about why the FBI had not passed along Popov's warning, Hoover provided bureaucratic answers. The information had been evaluated. It had been deemed not sufficiently credible to warrant dissemination. There were concerns about sources and methods. It was all lies, of course, or at best post hoc rationalizations. The truth was simpler and uglier. Hoover had not passed the warning because he did not like Duško Popov. But Hoover was skilled at the Washington game, and he knew how to protect himself. He implied that Popov had been suspected of being a German plant, a triple agent feeding false information. He suggested that sharing the warning might have compromised other intelligence operations. He buried his personal vendetta under layers of bureaucratic jargon, and because no one in Washington wanted to start a war with J. Edgar Hoover, the matter was quietly dropped. Duško Popov learned about Pearl Harbor while he was still in America. His reaction was complicated. On one level, as a professional intelligence officer, he understood that warnings get missed, that intelligence failures happen, that the fog of war obscures even clear signals. But on another level, he was devastated. He had risked his life to deliver that warning. He had understood its significance. He had done everything right, and it had not been enough. Not because he had failed, but because the man who received his warning had let personal bias override professional judgment. The weight of that knowledge would stay with Popov for the rest of his life. In the years after Pearl Harbor, Popov continued his work as a double agent. He returned to Europe and played a crucial role in Operation Fortitude, the elaborate deception plan that convinced the Germans the D-Day invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. His intelligence work during this period was brilliant and consequential. He helped save countless lives by contributing to the success of the Normandy landings. But the Pearl Harbor failure haunted him. In his memoirs, published decades later, he wrote about the warning and the FBI's refusal to act. He was diplomatic, more diplomatic than Hoover deserved, but the pain was evident. Popov felt guilt, even though the failure was not his. He felt he should have done more, should have found a way to make them listen, should have gone over Hoover's head even if it meant blowing his cover and ending his intelligence career. This is the burden carried by Cassandras throughout history. The mythological Cassandra was cursed to see the future, but never be believed. Modern Cassandras, the people who warn of dangers that others refuse to see, carry a different curse. The guilt of survival, the knowledge that they were right, the haunting question of whether they could have done more to make people listen. Popov lived into old age, dying in 1981. He saw the end of World War II, the Cold War, the transformation of the intelligence world he had known. He saw J. Edgar Hoover finally die in 1972, still in power, still feared, still protecting secrets that would not be fully revealed until decades later. And Popov knew, with the bitter wisdom that comes from experience, that the pattern that had doomed his warning about Pearl Harbor had not disappeared. Intelligence agencies still hoarded information. Bureaucrats still let personal prejudices override professional judgment. Cassandras still went unheeded. The story of Dusko Popov and the Pearl Harbor warning is often told as a simple tale of an opportunity missed. But it is more than that. It is a story about how institutions fail when personal animosity is allowed to corrupt professional processes. It is a story about how prejudice kills, not just metaphorically but literally, not just careers but people. It is a story about how the right information in the wrong hands is worthless and how power without wisdom is dangerous. Consider the layers of failure here. First, there was the technical intelligence failure, the inability of American agencies to share information and connect dots. This was a systemic problem, and after Pearl Harbor, reforms were implemented. The Office of Strategic Services was created, predecessor to the CIA, specifically to coordinate intelligence analysis and prevent this kind of fragmentation. But second, and more insidiously, there was the personal failure. Hoover's decision to let his dislike of Popov's lifestyle override his duty to protect American lives. This kind of failure is harder to reform away because it is rooted in human psychology, in the biases and prejudices that everyone carries. You cannot fix it with organizational charts and procedural manuals. You can only guard against it by creating cultures that value information over informants, substance over style, truth over personal comfort. The tragedy is that such cultures are rare. In most organizations, most of the time, the messenger matters as much as the message, probably more. People believe the information they want to believe, delivered by people they want to trust. They dismiss uncomfortable truths, especially when those truths come from uncomfortable messengers. Popov was uncomfortable for Hoover in every way. He represented a moral worldview that Hoover rejected. He lived a lifestyle that Hoover found repugnant. He was everything that Hoover was not. Sexually confident, socially at ease, comfortable with ambiguity and complexity. Hoover built his life and career on rigid categories and absolute certainties. Popov lived in shades of gray, playing multiple sides, inhabiting multiple identities. The clash was inevitable, and when the clash came, Hoover had the power to decide which truth would be heard. He chose to silence the truth because he did not like the truth teller, and people died. If you are watching this, if you have made it this far into this story, then you understand something important. You understand that history is not just about great armies and famous battles. It is about individual decisions, small moments, personal prejudices that cascade into catastrophe. You understand that the people who tried to warn, who tried to speak truth to power, who tried to make a difference, deserve to be remembered even when, especially when, they failed to change the outcome. This channel exists to tell these stories, to rescue from obscurity the people who were right when everyone else was wrong, to honor the Cassandras, the whistleblowers, the inconvenient truth-tellers, to ask uncomfortable questions about power, prejudice, and the patterns that repeat themselves across history. If you believe these stories matter, if you think it is important to remember the warnings that went unheeded and the people who delivered them, then subscribe. Hit that notification bell. Because there are more stories like Dusko Popov's. Stories of individual courage crushed by institutional inertia. Stories of brilliant insights dismissed by mediocre minds. Stories of truth killed by comfort, innovation strangled by tradition, progress blocked by prejudice. These stories deserve an audience. The people who lived them deserve to be remembered. And the lessons they teach deserve to be learned so that maybe, just maybe, next time someone walks into an office with a critical warning, they will be judged by the quality of their information rather than the cut of their suit. Subscribe and help keep these stories alive. Help build a community that values inconvenient truths over comfortable lies. Help create a space where being right matters more than being liked, where competence counts more than conformity. Dusko Popov lived with the burden of knowing he had tried and failed to save thousands of lives. The least we can do is remember his attempt and learn from why it failed. In the decades since Pearl Harbor, historians have debated endlessly about whether the attack could have been prevented. Some argue that even if Popov's warning had been passed to military commanders, it might not have changed anything. Admiral Kimmel and General Short might not have believed it any more than Hoover did. The institutional resistance to believing that Japan would dare attack American territory was strong across the military establishment. Others argue that Popov's warning, combined with the other intelligence indicators, would have been enough to put Hawaii on high alert. Perhaps not enough to prevent the attack entirely, but enough to have aircraft in the air, ships at sea, defenses ready. The difference between complete surprise and partial readiness could have saved hundreds of lives and prevented some of the worst damage. We will never know. What we do know is that the warning was not passed, and that failure to pass it was rooted in J. Edgar Hoover's personal antipathy toward Dusko Popov. This is documented fact, confirmed by FBI records that were eventually declassified and by testimony from agents who worked the case. Hoover's prejudice was not the only reason Pearl Harbor happened, but it was one reason, and in the calculus of historical causation, that matters. It matters because it shows how fragile security is, how dependent on the character of individuals in key positions. It matters because it demonstrates that systems and procedures are not enough. You need people of wisdom and judgment, people who can separate their personal feelings from their professional duties, people who understand that the stakes are too high for pettiness. Hoover failed that test. He was brilliant in many ways, a gifted administrator, a savvy political operator, a pioneer in modern law enforcement. But when it mattered most, when lives hung in the balance, he let his personal biases override his judgment. And that failure is part of his legacy, alongside his accomplishments. Dusko Popov's life after World War II was comfortable but never entirely happy. He had money, he had adventures, he had the satisfaction of having served his adopted country well during the war. Ian Fleming, who knew Popov and worked in British naval intelligence during the war, used him as one of several models for James Bond, combining Popov's charm and sophistication with elements from other agents to create the fictional super spy. Popov should have been celebrated as a hero. In Britain, he was to a degree. He received recognition from MI6, though the secret world does not go in for public medals and parades. But in America, his contribution was never properly acknowledged. The FBI never admitted its failure. Hoover never apologized. The official investigations into Pearl Harbor barely mentioned Popov's warning, and when they did, the language was vague and non-committal. This must have been galling for Popov. He had done his job perfectly. He had gathered the intelligence, recognized its significance, delivered it to the proper authorities, and explained its implications. Every step had been done correctly, and yet the system failed. Or rather, one man in the system failed, and the structure of power protected that man from accountability. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of the Popov story. Accountability matters. In intelligence services, in government, in any organization where decisions have life and death consequences, there must be accountability for failure. Not the ritual sacrifice of scapegoats, the way Kimmel and Short were sacrificed after Pearl Harbor, but genuine accountability that reaches to the actual decision-makers whose judgment failed. Hoover should have been held accountable for burying Popov's warning. He should have been questioned, investigated, and if the facts warranted it, removed from his position. But Hoover was too powerful. He had made himself invulnerable through a combination of political alliances, personal blackmail material, and ruthless destruction of opponents. He was untouchable, and he knew it. This untouchability corrupted not just the FBI but American government more broadly. For decades, presidents and attorneys general were afraid to challenge Hoover or rein in his excesses because they knew he could destroy them. The files he kept on political leaders, filled with sexual indiscretions, financial improprieties, and personal secrets, were his insurance policy against accountability. The Popov case is just one example of how this corruption played out. There were others. Hoover's obsession with pursuing communists while ignoring organized crime. His vendetta against Martin Luther King Jr., including illegal wiretaps and attempts at blackmail. His protection of informants who committed crimes, including murder, because they provided useful intelligence. Over and over, Hoover's personal prejudices and political paranoia distorted the FBI's mission and harmed innocent people. And over, he escaped accountability because he was too dangerous to challenge. This pattern persisted until his death. Only after Hoover died in 1972 did the full extent of his abuses begin to emerge. Congressional investigations revealed the illegal surveillance, the political manipulation, the blackmail files. Reforms were implemented, including term limits for FBI directors to prevent anyone from ever again accumulating Hoover's kind of unchecked power. But the damage had been done, and some of it was irreversible. The people Hoover destroyed stayed destroyed. The warnings he ignored stayed ignored. The opportunities he squandered stayed squandered. Duško Popov was one of many victims of Hoover's prejudices, but his case is unique because the consequences were so immediate and so catastrophic. Most of Hoover's victims suffered personal harm, ruined careers, destroyed reputations, broken families. Popov's case resulted in mass death. That makes it different. That makes it important to remember. Because if we forget how Pearl Harbor happened, if we reduce it to a simple story of intelligence failure without examining the personal failures that enabled it, then we learn nothing useful. We create the illusion that better systems and procedures would have prevented the disaster, when in fact better character in key leadership positions was what was really needed. Systems are important. Procedures matter. But, at the end of the day, institutions are run by people, and the character of those people determines whether the institution serves its mission or betrays it. Think about what Hoover could have done differently. When the FBI agents brought him Popov's warning, he could have set aside his personal distaste for the messenger and evaluated the message on its merits. He could have called in Navy intelligence officers and said, "Here is information from a proven British agent about Japanese interest in Pearl Harbor. It may be nothing, but it may be significant. You should evaluate it." That simple act, taking 10 minutes to make a phone call and pass along information, could have changed history. Instead, Hoover let his ego and his prejudices dictate his response. He decided that a man who slept with actresses could not possibly be a credible intelligence source. He decided that a Playboy spy was not to be taken seriously. He decided that his personal moral code was more important than his professional duty. And he was wrong. Catastrophically, historically, unforgivably wrong. But he never admitted it. There is no record of Hoover ever acknowledging that he had mishandled the Popov case. No memo, no conversation, no moment of reflection where he admitted to himself or others that his judgment had failed. This is perhaps the most damning thing about Hoover's character. He was incapable of admitting error. In his mind, he was always right, always justified, always acting in America's best interests. This kind of arrogance, common among powerful people, is dangerous precisely because it prevents learning and growth. If you cannot admit you were wrong, you cannot improve. You are doomed to repeat your mistakes. Hoover did repeat his mistakes over and over throughout his career. The pattern of letting personal prejudice override professional judgment, established with Popov, continued for decades. And because Hoover was never held accountable, he never changed. The system that enabled him never changed. And other institutions, seeing that power could insulate you from accountability, learned the wrong lessons. The question that haunts anyone studying the Popov case is, what if? What if Hoover had passed the warning? What if Navy intelligence had taken it seriously? What if Admiral Kimmel had ordered the fleet to sea on December 7th? What if the attack had been met with American planes in the air and ships ready to fight? The attack might still have succeeded. The Japanese plan was good, their pilots skilled, their execution excellent. But the damage would certainly have been less. Ships at sea are harder to hit than ships in harbor. Planes in the air can fight back. An alert defense can impose costs on attackers. The Japanese might have sunk some ships and destroyed some planes, but they would not have achieved the overwhelming tactical victory they did achieve. The psychological impact would have been different. Instead of complete surprise and humiliation, it would have been a hard-fought battle. American morale would still have been damaged, but not shattered. And perhaps, with some warning of Japanese intentions, American commanders would have taken seriously the possibility of other Japanese moves. In the event, the Japanese attacked not just Pearl Harbor but also the Philippines, Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, and Malaya, all on the same day or within hours of each other. American and Allied forces in those locations were caught almost as flat-footed as the forces at Pearl Harbor, even though they had hours of warning after the Hawaii attack. If there had been days or weeks of warning, if Popov's intelligence had triggered a general alert throughout the Pacific, the initial Japanese onslaught might have been blunted. Again, we cannot know. History does not offer controlled experiments. We have the timeline we have, and we can only speculate about alternatives. But the speculation is not idle. Understanding how close we came to having adequate warning, understanding how a single man's prejudice squandered that warning, should make us think carefully about how we structure decision-making in security matters. How do we prevent personality from overriding process? How do we ensure that critical information reaches people who can act on it, regardless of who delivers it? How do we build institutional cultures that value truth over comfort, competence over likability, warnings over reassurance? These are not easy questions, and there are no perfect answers. But the Popov case gives us a starting point. It shows us in stark and tragic terms what happens when we get it wrong. In his later years, Popov was sometimes asked about Pearl Harbor. His answers were always measured. He did not rail against Hoover. He did not claim that he alone could have prevented the disaster. He simply stated the facts. He had received intelligence suggesting a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. He had delivered that intelligence to American authorities, and the intelligence had not been acted upon. When pressed about why it had not been acted upon, he was diplomatic but clear. He had not been trusted by the FBI director. His lifestyle had been viewed as evidence of unreliability. Personal factors had interfered with professional judgment. Popov understood the spy game well enough to know that sometimes sources are mistrusted for good reasons. Agents lie. Double agents can become triple agents. Information can be planted to deceive. Skepticism is healthy in the intelligence world, but he also understood the difference between healthy skepticism and irrational prejudice. Hoover's dismissal of the Pearl Harbor warning had not been based on a careful analysis of Popov's reliability as a source. MI6 had vouched for him. He had a track record of providing accurate information. The Pearl Harbor questionnaire was a physical document, not a rumor or an unverifiable claim. There was no legitimate professional reason to dismiss it. The dismissal was personal, and Popov knew it. That knowledge must have been bitter. To know that you had been right, that you had done everything correctly, and that the failure was not yours but belonged to a powerful man who simply did not like you, that is a hard truth to live with. Popov carried it with dignity, but he carried it. We live in an age where information flows faster than ever before. Intelligence agencies have technologies that Popov and his contemporaries could barely imagine. Satellite surveillance, signals intelligence, cyber espionage, data analytics. The tools available to modern intelligence services are extraordinary. And yet, intelligence failures still happen. Warnings still go unheeded. Disasters still occur because the right information did not reach the right people at the right time, or because the right people did not believe it when they saw it. The September 11th attacks in 2001 were, like Pearl Harbor, a massive intelligence failure. There were warnings, indicators, pieces of intelligence that suggested Al-Qaeda was planning something big. But the information was fragmented across agencies, and no one put it all together in time. The parallels to Pearl Harbor are striking and sobering. In both cases, the intelligence community had pieces of the puzzle. In both cases, institutional and personal factors prevented those pieces from being assembled into a clear picture. In both cases, the result was mass death and national trauma. The lesson should be obvious. We have not solved the problems that allowed Pearl Harbor to happen. We have better technology, more sophisticated analysis, more resources devoted to intelligence work. But we still have the human factors: bureaucratic rivalry, institutional inertia, personal prejudice, cognitive bias. These are not problems that can be solved with bigger budgets or better computers. They require cultural change, leadership accountability, and a commitment to putting mission before ego. And that is hard. It is hard because organizations are made up of people, and people are flawed. We bring our biases to work with us. We make decisions based on emotions as much as logic. We trust people who look like us, talk like us, think like us, and distrust people who are different. These tendencies are deeply rooted in human psychology, and they do not disappear just because someone puts on a suit and works in a government building. So, what do we do? How do we honor Duško Popov's memory and the memory of the 2,403 Americans who died at Pearl Harbor? We start by telling the truth. We tell the story of what happened, honestly and completely, without sanitizing the personal failures that enabled the disaster. We name J. Edgar Hoover as one of the men whose decisions contributed to Pearl Harbor. Not the only one, not the primary one, but a significant one. We acknowledge that his prejudice against Popov prevented a critical warning from being acted upon. We use this historical example to illustrate a pattern that continues to this day. The pattern of truth being killed by bias, competence dismissed because of lifestyle, warnings ignored because the warner is disliked. And then we commit to doing better. In our own lives, in our own organizations, in our own decision-making, we commit to evaluating information on its merits rather than judging it by its source. We commit to listening to uncomfortable truths delivered by uncomfortable people. We commit to holding leaders accountable when they let personal prejudice override professional duty. These commitments are not easy to keep. It is human nature to prefer comfortable lies from people we like over uncomfortable truths from people we do not. But the cost of indulging that preference is too high. Pearl Harbor is the proof. 2,403 dead is the price we paid the last time we let personal prejudice override professional judgment at a critical moment. We owe it to those dead, and to Duško Popov, who tried to save them, to learn the lesson and do better. That is how we honor them. Not with monuments and speeches, though those have their place, but with a genuine commitment to being better, to judging people by their competence rather than their conformity, to listening to warnings even when they come from sources we find distasteful. That is the legacy of Duško Popov, the real-life James Bond who warned America about Pearl Harbor and was ignored because he liked beautiful women and expensive champagne. His warning was right. His work was impeccable. His courage was unquestionable. And none of it mattered because one powerful man could not see past his own prejudices. Remember that. Remember him. And resolve to be better than the people who ignored him.